I thought I'd die alone in that cabin, until a wolf knocked on my door. When I saw the dark stain in the snow, my heart froze because I realized it wasn't carrion, it was someone's destiny. I had risen before dawn to fill my rusted kettle at the creek's edge, as I had for countless winters, expecting nothing more than the usual hush of ice and the distant cry of a jay. My boots crunched hollowly over the frozen ground, each breath a mist that faded into pale morning light. Then, just beyond the drift where footprints of deer led off into shadow, I spotted the stain, so dark against all that white it drew me like a magnet. I bent low at first, thinking perhaps some fox had met its end here, leaving behind a mess of fur and blood to warn scavengers. My old bones ached with every movement, but I could not stop myself. The closer I crept, the more I felt a strange weight settle in my chest, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When I knelt and brushed a glob of ice aside, I saw the shape, no grown beast, but a tiny form curled at the water's edge, fur matted and crusted red, legs splayed at odd angles. My breath caught as I recognized the creature in front of me, a wolf pup, no bigger than a house cat, so small and fragile it looked like hope itself bleeding out on the snow. His chest barely rose and fell. My mind spun with questions I had no right to ask. How had he survived the night? Was his mother out there, somewhere beyond the trees, frantic and starving? I reached toward him, hand trembling, half convinced I would startle him into death. His ribs showed through ragged fur. Each shallow exhale seemed an act of sheer will. I closed my eyes for a heartbeat, willing him to fade, to let me slip away and leave this awful burden behind. But then his eyes cracked open. They were two dark pools rimmed with white, the pupils dilated like tiny moons in a frozen sky. He lifted his head unevenly and looked at me. There was fear, yes, raw, primal terror that pulsed through his veins like ice. But beneath it, flickering like the last ember of a dying fire, I saw something stranger, pleading. There was so much pleading in those eyes, I couldn't turn away. It felt as though he was begging me to carry him through the darkness, to bear witness to whatever remained in his shattered life. My heart thundered so loudly I feared he might hear it. I scooped him up, despite every instinct screaming that I should leave him to the wolves. His tiny body was bone and stray muscle, but he weighed more in my arms than any burden I had shouldered in decades. I wrapped him in my coat, surprised at how warm he felt against my chest, and rose slowly, every step away from the creek a struggle. The world seemed to shift around me. The loneliness I had carried since my wife's passing felt suddenly intolerable. Back at the cabin, I laid him on a threadbare blanket before the stove. I knelt, lit the old metal lamp, and watched him with hands calloused by winters and woodcutting. He whimpered once, a sound that tore through my soul. I tore a strip from my own undershirt and bound his hurt leg as best I could. Every knot I tied felt like a promise I was nowhere near ready to keep. I boiled water in the kettle until steam curled like ghostly fingers, then dripped it through a cloth into a small tin bowl. He lapped it with a tongue swelled from thirst, his body shivering so hard I feared the stitches would tear. I sat beside him through the day, ignoring the ache in my joints, listening to the wind lash at the cabin walls. I wanted to believe that when I woke tomorrow, this would all have been a dream, and that the pup would be gone, vanished like a phantom in winter's haze. But when dusk fell and I reached to check his eyes, they opened again, and he looked at me with that same pleading glow. It was then I knew. I thought he would die in my arms. But nature had other plans. I fetched an old bay leaf from the shelf, crushed it between my fingers, and sprinkled it into the water, hoping the old stories held some truth. He drank eagerly, and I felt a flicker of hope. Night settled deep and silent around us. I lay on the floor, my back against the stove, listening to the pup's soft breathing. I told him in a voice rough as gravel, "Rest now, little one. I will not fail you." Somewhere beyond the window, a branch scraped against the glass, and I held my breath, half expecting the forest itself to judge me. But when no second howl answered back, I let out a shaky laugh. Sleep found me at last, but when I woke before the sun, the pup was gone from my side. Panic rose in my throat until I saw him across the room, curled inside the kettle, still alive. I knelt and laid a gentle hand on his head. He blinked up at me as though to say, "Thank you." I closed my eyes, feeling tears slip down my face. I had come to the creek for water, expecting a routine morning. Instead, I had cradled a dying pup and watched life flicker anew. I did not know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew I could never unsee those eyes or unhear his plea. My solitude was broken, and in its place, something I once thought lost, purpose. When I lifted him into my arms, a pulse of fear shot through me. What had I done, carrying a wild creature into my home? My cabin door creaked shut behind us, sealing out the wind and the indifferent forest beyond. Inside, the stove's feeble warmth did little to thaw the chill in my bones or the tremor in my soul. I laid him gently on the plank floor, his small body barely heavier than a sack of potatoes, but every muscle in my arms ached as if I'd hauled a felled tree. I felt like an intruder, hiding a forbidden thing beneath my roof. By the hearth, I fetched a basin of steaming water and set about cleaning the wound. His fur, matted with ice and blood, peeled away in clumps as I dabbed at it with a rag. He whimpered, a guttural sound so fragile it broke me, and I forced my hand to steady. "Sorry, little one," I whispered, though my voice cracked like old wood. I bound his leg with strips torn from an undershirt, knotting carefully around raw flesh. Each motion felt absurd, like trying to mend the dying heart of the world itself. I glanced at the rifle propped against the wall and felt shame burn in my chest. What right did I have to spare him when every instinct screamed to stay safe, to leave well enough alone? Night plunged the cabin into darkness. I banked the fire to embers, leaving only a dim glow. Sleep fled me as I crouched beside him, every pop and sigh of the wood burning in the stove, echoing like footsteps at the door. I couldn't tear my eyes from his small form, curled and shivering on the blanket. My throat felt dry, my heart drumming so loud I was sure he heard it. I tried to imagine the wolf pack roaming free beyond the pines, the call of his mother drifting on the wind, but those thoughts only made me grit my teeth in guilt. I fed him a few spoonfuls of broth. He sniffed warily, then licked it from my palm, his tongue soft and warm, like fire against my cold skin. The contact sent a jolt through me, an electric reminder that this was no mere animal, but a living, breathing soul. With each sip, his shudders lessened. His eyes, once cloudy with pain, brightened, and I dared to hope he might pull through. My breathing grew easier, though the ache in my arms only deepened. Hours dragged by in silence, broken only by his soft whimpers and the slow creak of the cabin settling. I found myself talking to him, mumbling memories I'd long buried, the laughter of my boy when he chased rabbits along the creek, the gentle voice of my wife calling me in from the cold. The words felt foolish on my tongue, but I could not stop. He seemed to listen, head tipped, eyes half closed in trust. Never in all my years had I felt such a stirring in my chest, a flicker of warmth I had thought extinguished with their passing. Around midnight, I dozed in a chair by the stove. I dreamed of the forest turning on me, wolves' eyes glowing in the darkness as they circled my cabin. I jerked awake with a start, sweat chilling on my brow, only to see the pup stirring beside me. His ribs rose and fell in steady rhythm, and he licked my fingers as if to say, "I'm still here." A lump formed in my throat. I stroked his head, marveling at the softness of his fur and felt tears sting my eyes. Have I gone mad? I wondered. Why do I care so deeply for a wild thing that should never have crossed my path? As dawn crept through the frosted window, I gathered enough courage to stand. My back protested, but when I called his name, I had decided to call him Bran, his head lifted, ears perking. He crawled toward me on unsteady legs and pressed his muzzle against my palm. Then, in a moment that cleaved my heart open, he licked my hand, gentle, deliberate. I stumbled back, breath catching in my throat. He trusts me, I thought. I can't betray that. Fear and wonder collided inside me. I was a man who had vowed never to let another soul in, yet here I was, careworn and sleepless, utterly devoted to this wild pup. Loneliness and attachment warred in my chest, desperation to protect him tangled with dread of the danger I'd invited. Each time I glanced at him, my resolve faltered. He might live, he might die, and either outcome would break me in ways I could not fathom. As the sun rose higher, I fetched fresh water and wood for the stove. Bran, now steadier on his paws, followed me with bright eyes, tilting his head as though puzzled by the cabin's strange comforts. I watched him explore the small space, sniffing at the worn furniture, and felt something awaken in me, hope. But even as I considered building a makeshift bed for him by the fire, a voice in my mind whispered, "You're insane. You brought the wild into your home. What happens when he grows?" I knelt and met his gaze, the flickering flames dancing in his pupils. I thought this was merely saving a life, I murmured. But maybe this is the beginning of something far greater. My hands shook as I reached out and laid them on his shoulders. In that instant, I understood that this was more than a rescue. It was a reckoning. And though my mind reeled with uncertainty, my heart had never been clearer. I thought he would be just another burden, but nature had other plans. When I heard those first unsteady footsteps beside the stove, my heart soared because I realized he had decided to live. All night long, I had sat in the rocking chair, dozing with one eye open, listening to the hiss of the fire and the faint rasp of his breath. By dawn, he stirred, head bobbing on wobbly legs, testing the floorboards with shy curiosity. I held my breath as he rose, each step a tiny miracle, until he stood, and I saw in his eyes the spark of survival. I wrapped a threadbare blanket around us both, guiding him to a patch of sunlight that slanted through the frosted window. His paws, still slick with icy slush, slipped and slid, but he kept at it, determined. When he finally plopped onto his haunches and looked up at me, tail wagging in a slow, hopeful rhythm, I laughed aloud, a sound I hadn't made in years. "You're a fighter, aren't you?" I whispered, and he blinked, tongue flicking as if in agreement. I named him Gray, for the swirl of ash in his fur and the quiet resilience I saw shining through his gaze. Gray settled near the stove each night, curling his dirt-speckled body against the warm iron as though it were a cradle. I would wake in the pale morning light to find him pressed against my leg, soft whimpers promising faithfulness. I began to believe he might truly heal. One afternoon, I ventured into the yard to chop wood, Gray trailing behind, staggering over frost-hardened ground. I swung the axe, and as I lifted my foot to step back, I misjudged the uneven plank and tumbled into the snow. Pain bloomed in my shoulder, sharp and sudden, and I lay there, stunned. For a moment, I wondered if I'd ever move again. Then I heard it, a frantic bark, high and urgent. Gray leapt forward, paws digging into the drifts, and disappeared from sight. I called his name, but there was only silence, until I saw him emerge, a glove clenched delicately in his jaws. It was my wool mitten, the one I dropped when I fell. He trotted back and placed it at my feet, eyes bright with concern. My breath caught. He had saved me for me. I pressed a hand to my chest, overwhelmed by the weight of what had just happened. "You're not just an animal," I croaked, tears stinging as I rested my palm on his head. "You're something more." He looked at me like I was his own, a bond sealing between us that needed no words. In that moment, the lonely bitterness that had hollowed my days since my family was gone cracked open, letting warmth seep in. Gray nudged my mitten with his nose, then curled beside me as if to say, "I've got you now." I laughed through my tears and hugged him awkwardly, the snow melting cold against my cheek but feeling strangely comforting. Over the next weeks, Gray's strength grew. He chased me around the yard, pouncing on dangling branches and howling at the wind as though greeting an old friend. At dawn, I found him perched on the porch railing, scanning the forest with fierce intensity, and for the first time, I saw not just a pup, but a guardian. I built him a den of straw near the stove, but he preferred to sleep on the hard wood beside me, breathing softly in time with my own rhythm. Yet even as joy bloomed inside me, doubt flickered at the edge of my mind. What would happen when he outgrew these walls? Would he remember me then, or vanish into the wild as though we'd never met? I pushed the thought away, focusing instead on the small miracles he performed each day. How he retrieved water from the creek in a battered tin cup, how he flopped onto his back when I scratched behind his ears. One evening, I found him staring into the dying embers of the stove, eyes distant as though listening to some secret song of the forest. I sat beside him silently, feeling the gentle rise and fall of his broad chest. It struck me then how much he had changed me. I had traded solitude for devotion, fear for wonder. I stroked his thickening coat and murmured, "You've brought me back to life, little friend." I thought he would stay with me forever, but nature had other plans. That night, I was jolted awake by a soft scrape at the door. Gray's fur prickled under my hand as he froze beside me, every muscle tensed. My heart pounded in the dark cabin, where the only light came from the dying embers in the stove. I gripped my rifle, certain that any moment now a pack would burst through the door, ravenous and furious. But the noise ceased. A hush fell, broken only by Gray's low growl. I crept to the window and peered through the frost. There, just beyond the porch, stood a wolfess, her coat the color of moonlit ash, her body sleek and powerful. She paused in the pale glow of the lantern I had left burning on the threshold. I expected her to snarl, to charge, to claim her domain. Instead, she stepped inside, silent as snowfall, and settled herself directly across from me. I froze. My breath caught in my chest. The rifle slipped from my trembling fingers, thudding against the wooden floor. I watched in stunned silence as she sat so still, she might have been a statue carved from ice. Gray, eyes narrowed but unafraid, slid forward on his belly. He pressed his nose to the floor, inching closer to his mother. She sniffed at his fur, once, twice, then lifted her head and regarded me. In that moment, she looked at me as though she understood that I had saved her pup's life, that I had given him a second chance few in the wild would have offered. Her amber eyes held no aggression, only calm acknowledgement. My tears sprang unbidden. I sank to my knees, unable to tear my gaze away from hers. I felt as though I was witnessing a miracle, a silent communion between man and beast. I could not move, could not speak. All I could do was watch as she reached a paw forward and gently brushed Gray's muzzle, guiding him back toward the door. He hesitated for a heartbeat, looking back at me with those trusting eyes I had come to love. Then he rose, slipping past the wolfess's silent form, and stepped into the night. The door swung closed behind them with a soft click. I stumbled forward to press my palm against the cold wood, as if I could still feel their warmth. My chest heaved with overwhelming emotion, relief, sorrow, awe, all tangled together. I wept without shame, the tears steaming on my weathered cheeks. For the first time I understood the fierce loyalty of these creatures, the depth of family bonds that transcended fear and hunger. I wiped my eyes on my sleeve and sank back to the floor, staring at the spot where they had vanished into the forest. Minutes passed like hours. I listened to the wind fade. The night returned to its quiet watch. I spoke into the stillness, my voice rough and raw. Safe journeys, my friends. But there was no reply, only the echo of my own words. I stood and crossed to the table, where a single paw print remained pressed into the thin layer of dust. I traced its outline with a trembling finger, marveling at how something so small could leave such an imprint on my heart. My solitude felt shattered and reformed, as though the world had tilted on its axis and shown me a hidden path back to wonder. I moved to tend the stove, piling on logs until the flames danced to life. The cabin glowed with warmth, but I felt cold instead, aching with the absence of those two wolves who had come to my door. I sank into the rocking chair, hands folded over my chest, eyes fixed on the flames. Fear and gratitude warred inside me. I had risked everything to save a wild pup, and in return I received a gift more precious than life itself, proof that the line between man and nature could be drawn in kindness. I pressed my hand to my heart, still trembling. I thought they were saying goodbye. When spring's first thaw cracked the ice on the creek, Gray slipped from my sight as silently as a whisper. I found his empty patch of straw before dawn, the hinges of his makeshift den cold and still. I called his name into the pale morning light. Gray. But the only answer was the ragged cry of a crow overhead. My heart pounded, and I stumbled across the yard, scanning every shadow between the budding birches. He was gone. I spent that day hunting for footprints in the mud, pressing bare palms into the warm earth to trace the outline of his paws, but the rains had washed them away. I returned to the cabin with a hollow in my chest I hadn't known possible. All night, I lay in my bedroll by the stove, head heavy on my folded coat, listening to the wind sigh through the cracks in the walls. Each time I drifted towards sleep, I jolted awake, crying, "Gray!" into the dark. Days passed, then weeks, but the cabin remained silent. I went through the motions of my routine, chopping wood at dawn, fetching water, stoking the fire, but each task felt drained of purpose. I found myself pausing at the window, reading the forest's edge like an ancient script, desperate for any sign of him. Yet the trees stood unmoving, indifferent. I began writing again. With a shaky hand, I penned in my old leather notebook the memory of Gray's first breath in my arms, the moment he licked the bruise on my knee after I fell, the deep brown of his gaze when he looked at me as if I were family. The pages filled with my confession of fear and gratitude, a litany of every miracle he had wrought in my life. Writing soothed me, stitch by stitch, until words replaced the silence that threatened to swallow me. I baked bread for the first time in years, kneading the dough on the table my wife and I had carved our initials into decades ago. The scent of yeast and warm flour drifted through the cabin like a benediction. I pulled the golden loaf from the oven, crust crackling, and placed it on a plate. Each slice I tore off felt like an offering, each bite a taste of hope I was determined to believe in. Still, when the evening shadows lengthened, I found myself whispering into the hush, "He will return." My voice wavered, but the words gave me comfort, as though the forest itself might carry them to wherever Gray roamed. I never spoke them aloud to another soul. There was no one to hear. But in the quiet of my cabin, those words were as solid as the chimney's stones. A month became a season, and a season became a year. The sap flowed in the maples, then dried back into bark. The flowers bloomed, withered, and bloomed again. Through it all, I tended the land and tended my heart, keeping vigil in the only way I knew how. My journal swelled with entries, sketches of paw prints, fragments of dreams filled with his silhouette, prayers murmured to the moon. On the anniversary of his departure, I stood at the creek's edge at dawn, the same spot where I had first found him. I knelt and ran my fingers through the cold water, stirring the reflection of pale sky. I closed my eyes and held my breath, waiting for the crackle of paws on ice, the soft rustle of fur. Nothing came but my own echo in the glassy stream. I walked back to the cabin and stoked the fire, flames licking the iron stovepipe, and placed a fresh journal beside the kettle. I poured a cup of tea and sat in the rocking chair, rocking gently, my hands wrapped around the warm tin mug. I stared at the empty straw den in the corner, tracing its contours with my gaze as though mapping a missing piece of my soul. Then, in the quiet between heartbeats, I felt a stirring inside me, not grief nor joy, but something soft and sure. I realized I had changed. My back was straighter, my breath deeper, my spirit lighter. The grief I had carried was no longer a weight, but a current guiding me onward. I understood at last that Gray's absence had not broken me. It had freed me to remember the kindness that still flowed in the world. I closed my eyes and whispered into the dusk, "He will return." The words floated upward like a prayer, untethered yet alive. I did not know if he ever would, but for the first time, I believed that my life, our life, was larger than any single moment. The forest waited beyond the door, patient as ever, secrets buried in the thawing earth. 3 years passed, and I nearly forgot. When the first crack of frozen timber broke the midnight silence, my heart seized because I knew wolves had come. The wind howled beyond the walls of my cabin, and the stove's embers had long since died to a weak glow. I lay awake on my cot, senses straining for each sound. Then, footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps on the snow-slick porch. My breath caught in my throat, an old fear twisted in my gut. Gripping my rifle, I rose on unsteady legs, every joint protesting. I crept to the door, hand shaking so fiercely I could scarcely turn the latch. I thought of pack howls and flashing teeth, of talons ripping at flesh. I unhooked the bolt and flung the door open, my shotgun rising in trembling arms. The moonlight spilled across the clearing, cold and unforgiving. I aimed and held my breath. There, framed in silver light, stood a wolf enormous as a bear. His coat was thick and dark, fur shimmering with frost. His eyes, amber orbs deeper than any I had seen, fixed on mine. Beneath him stood 2 smaller forms, shapes I recognized as pups, their fur damp with snow. My finger hovered on the trigger, but my chest constricted. My heart thundered in my ears, drowning out every instinct that urged me to shoot. He did not snarl. He did not bare his fangs. He simply stood and looked at me, as if waiting. Waiting for what? I could not say. The pups pressed close to his legs, shivering but silent, eyes bright with curiosity. I felt tears sting my eyes, and my hands grew too heavy to hold the gun. I let it fall, dusting snow from the barrel, and sank to my knees on the porch's icy plank. He came, not as a beast, as a son, I murmured, voice thick with wonder. I had expected fear, but I was overwhelmed by something far more powerful, recognition. The wolf's gaze was not wild. It was familial. It was gratitude. One pup ventured forward, head lowering in a silent greeting. The larger wolf lowered himself slowly, nose brushing the smaller's back before lifting his head to me again. He cocked his head, and I felt the weight of years lift from my shoulders. The cold air burned my lungs, but I hardly noticed. My tears fell freely, steaming before they hit the snow. I stretched a hand toward him, palm open like a peace offering. He sniffed the air, nostrils flaring, and then advanced. When his muzzle brushed my fingers, warmth flooded through me. My tears turned to quiet sobs. I pressed my cheek to his fur, rough, thick, alive, and felt his pulse beneath my ear. Behind us, the pups circled, tails wagging in slow arcs. They sniffed at my boots, then nuzzled my knees. I laughed brokenly, the sound echoing into the silent forest. My loneliness shattered into a million shards, each one reflecting the bond we shared. The great wolf stepped back, casting a glance at me that felt like a benediction. He dipped his head, then turned and padded toward the trees, the pups trotting at his heels. I pressed a hand to my heart, unwilling to let go of the moment. I thought I would call after them, but no words came, only breath, white and fragile in the freezing air. They melted into the pines as silently as they had appeared. The moonlight shifted, and I was alone again on the porch, shotgun at my feet and soul laid bare. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the bottom step, staring at the spot where they had vanished. My tears froze on my beard, and I laughed in disbelief. I thought it was our final meeting, I whispered to the dark, my voice lost in the night. But I did not believe it. Deep inside, I felt a certainty that this was not the end. The forest, once a realm of dread, had become a place of hope. The wolves had shown me that family could transcend walls and seasons, that gratitude could bridge the divide between species. I rose at last, brushing snow from my coat, and closed the cabin door behind me. Inside, I relit the stove, its warmth seeping into my bones. I hung my rifle by the mantel, knowing I would never need it for fear again. As the flames danced, I pressed my hand to my chest, where my heartbeat had once been lonely, now thrummed with a fierce joy. I sat at the table, journal open before me, and wrote those words with a steady hand. He came not as a beast, but as a son. Then I paused, listening to the wind's soft answers beyond the logs. I knew my world had forever changed, and though I did not yet know when they would return, I was certain of one thing: I would be waiting. When dawn's pale light crept over the thawing fields, I heard a soft rustle at the edge of the clearing. My heart skipped, for I knew that sound. I rose from the porch, hands trembling, and there he was again, alone, majestic, the ash-gray wolf I had come to call family. He sat on the frozen earth, watching me with those piercing amber eyes that held both wildness and something like gratitude. I fetched a hunk of stale bread and a chunk of salted venison from my larder, carrying them out on a small wooden tray. My breath came in warm puffs that vanished in the cool morning air. He did not move, did not growl or prowl. He simply sat, calm as the still waters of the creek in winter. I placed the food a short distance before him, every step feeling as sacred as a pilgrimage. We did not speak. There was no need for words. Day after day, I had tended my loneliness like a stubborn wound. Yet, here, standing before this creature, I felt the scar begin to heal. He sniffed the offerings, and I watched the rise and fall of his flanks as he devoured them, powerful and silent. Then he lifted his head and looked at me again. In that gaze, I felt something resonate deep within my chest, something I had never known I was missing. The ache of years spent in solitude softened, replaced by a warmth I thought lost forever. I knelt on the porch step, hands resting on my knees, and spoke in a voice that trembled with wonder. You gave me something I didn't know I was searching for. The wolf's ears twitched, and he inclined his head once, as if acknowledging the truth of my words. I smiled through tears, feeling the world shift beneath my feet. For a timeless moment, we remained like that, two souls united by a bond neither of us could fully explain. Then, with a graceful turn, he rose and padded back toward the forest, blending into the budding green as though he had never been. Days passed, then weeks. The snow melted into wet earth and fledgling leaves unfurled on the birch trees, but the wolf did not return. I watched the horizon each morning, scanning the tree line for that ash-gray silhouette, but the forest remained still. I carried my morning tray to the same spot on the porch, set it down, and waited, though no footsteps ever answered my call. At night, I sat by the dying embers of the stove, replaying that spring morning in my mind. His eyes, so full of knowing, his quiet grace, his parting as if to say, "Remember." I found myself rising before dawn, trudging to the porch in solitude, peering into the half-light for any sign of him. My hopes flickered, like the lamp's flame, alive and fragile. I cleared the cabin's floorboards of last winter's dust. I polished the kettle until it gleamed. I planted seeds in a small patch of earth beyond the porch, hoping the wolf might pause there too one day. Each task I performed with care, as though preparing an altar for his return. But the days slipped by, and no shadow crossed the threshold. Sometimes a distant howl would drift on the breeze, and I would start at the sound, certain it was him calling back to me. My heart would race, only to slow with disappointment when the echo faded into the forest's hush. Still, I kept waiting. My solitude had been transformed by that single visit, no longer a prison, but a reminder that gratitude and wonder can arrive unannounced. I found solace in small routines, writing in my journal of that morning's confession, baking a fresh loaf each week, setting a bowl of water on the porch in case he grew thirsty. The world around me blossomed into life, wildflowers along the creek, birds at the feeder I built from scrap lumber. I existed in a quiet communion with nature, unburdened by fear. And then, one golden evening, as the sun dipped low and the woods glowed with spring's light, I realized with a pang that I thought it was over. No more visits, no more silent communion. I had woven our meeting into the fabric of my days so completely that his absence now felt permanent. I paused on the porch, hand poised over the door latch, heart heavy with longing, and in that instant, I thought, I believed this was the end. When the blizzard raged outside, I lay in my creaking bed, chest tight with each breath. My bones throbbed with age and illness, and I feared I might never feel warmth again. The wind howled like a wounded beast, rattling the shutters and flinging drifts of snow against the walls. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, though I did not trust these final hours. Then there came a knock, a soft, deliberate rap at the door, like a paw tapping glass. My heart jolted, each beat echoing in my ears. I struggled upright, every joint protesting, and reached for my cane. With trembling hands, I hobbled through the dim cabin, guided by the weak glow of the oil lamp. Each step was agony, but something in that knock, so gentle, so persistent, drove me forward. I grasped the latch and pulled. A blast of icy wind rushed in, carrying a swirl of snowflakes that stung my face. And there he stood, the ash-gray wolf, massive and regal, his fur crusted with frost. His amber eyes glowed with a familiar intelligence. My breath caught so sharply I thought my ribs might crack. My legs gave way beneath me, and I sank to my knees on the snow-packed threshold. Pain lanced through my body, but I could not look away. The wolf stepped forward, head low, nostrils flaring. He paused within a whisper's distance and lifted one great paw, treading carefully so as not to startle me further. Tears blurred my sight. I reached out with a trembling hand, gnarled with years and illness, and hesitated. My heart thundered. Was this real? Was I dreaming? Then the wolf lowered his massive muzzle and touched his cold, wet nose to my palm. In that electrifying instant, I knew I was not alone. I felt the pulse of his life against my own, a silent promise that compassion endures. The wind fell hushed, as though the storm itself paused to bear witness. Snowflakes drifted around us, but we stood still, two souls united across the chasm of species and time. He raised his head and looked at me as though bidding farewell. There was no menace in his eyes, only gratitude, loyalty, and something like love. Then, with a single graceful turn, he melted into the swirling white, leaving only his footprints behind. I remained on the doorstep, kneeling in the snow, chest heaving. My tears froze on my beard, and I did not mind. My heart felt lighter than it had in decades. I knew I had witnessed something impossible. This could not have happened. I whispered into the empty air. I should not have seen it. But I have. Nature is wiser than we think. It remembers kindness. I stumbled back inside and closed the door. The wolf's presence lingered like a warm ember in my soul. I sank to the floor and pressed my hand to my chest, feeling my heart still beating. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside me, there was a calm I once believed lost forever. If your heart is still racing, then you understand. Subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the truth about animals and life. If your heart is now full of awe, right, nature is wiser than us. When I saw the paw prints mingled with the scattered children's toys across the dusty floor of that long-abandoned house, my breath caught in my throat, because I knew this was no accident. When I saw the paw prints mingled with the scattered children's toys across the dusty floor of that long-abandoned house, my breath caught in my throat, because I knew this was no accident. I arrived at the edge of the overgrown clearing, just as the sun dipped behind the pines, casting elongated shadows over the twisting path. Rumor had it that someone had seen a lone fox cub wandering these woods, abandoned and starving. I'd spent decades as a forest ranger, and even in retirement, I couldn't ignore a call like this. I parked my old pickup beneath a crooked birch and grabbed my flashlight and field jacket. The air smelled of moss and damp earth, and every rustle in the underbrush set my pulse racing. The trail led me to what used to be a cluster of small cottages, once a thriving homestead before it was claimed by time and neglect. Roof beams sagged, windows gaped like empty eyes, and vines strangled the walls. I hesitated at the threshold of the largest structure, the one that looked most intact. Something about it felt alive. Inside, debris carpeted the floor, rotting floorboards, broken shutters, the remnants of forgotten lives. My beam caught on a line of tiny footprints, 4 oval pads, a central pad, the signature of canine gait. Then, a second set, the diminutive outline of bare human feet. My heart thumped so loudly I worried it would echo across the silent hall. Half the footprints were wolf prints, pressed deep into the dust as though the creature had lumbered cautiously through. The other half were those of a child, small, bare, surprisingly tender impressions. I froze. If a wolf was here, it could be just around the corner. My hand drifted to the flashlight, my mind racing through safety protocols drilled into me over years in the wild. Then I heard it, a soft, steady inhalation, childlike, innocent, utterly human. It was the sound of a small girl breathing, not a growl or a snarl. My whole body tensed. I'd come expecting an animal scrapbook. Rescuer saves cub, happy ending. Instead, I felt I'd stumbled into a story far stranger. I edged forward, every nerve on fire. Through the jagged doorway where a section of the wall had collapsed, I caught sight of them. Huddled together in a pool of fading afternoon light sat a little girl and a wolf. The girl wore a tattered dress, dirt caking her ankles, her dark hair tangled in knots. She stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes, her expression unreadable. Beside her lay the wolf, its fur matted, ribs faintly visible, but its stance was calm, almost deferential. Its golden eyes held mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, voice thick with disbelief. "Hey there, are you okay?" My words sounded brittle in the hush. The girl said nothing. She simply leaned closer to the wolf, as if finding comfort in its steady presence. The animal did not move, did not snarl, only held vigil. My mind raced. Maybe the wolf had wandered in to escape a rainstorm. Maybe the cubs I'd been told about had been misidentified. But the footprints, the breath of a child, the uncanny peace between them. It felt like something else entirely. A bond that defied everything I thought I knew about predator and prey. I tightened my grip on the flashlight. I should get help, I whispered to myself. But my legs felt like lead. I imagined backing away, closing the door, and calling for reinforcement. Yet some part of me hesitated, entranced by the impossible scene before me. And then, the wolf raised its head. Its ears pivoted forward, capturing the faintest hint of my movement. It studied me, gaze unwavering, as though weighing my intentions. I took an involuntary step back. My mind reeled. Had the wolf protected the girl? Was it guarding her? Or was it simply curious about the lone intruder? I glanced down at the little girl. She remained silent, her eyes fixed on me, a faint flicker of trust dancing in their depths. My own breath came in shallow gasps. I thought, maybe she's too frightened to speak. Maybe she trusts that wolf more than she ever could a stranger like me. It was then that the first sliver of doubt crept in. I thought, perhaps this is exactly what it looks like, a child and a wolf, sharing shelter. But something told me I was grossly underestimating the truth of what I'd stumbled into. "I'm not going to hurt you," I murmured, voice barely audible. The wolf's ears twitched. The girl blinked, and for a heartbeat, I swear her small hand twitched toward the beast's flank. Then she withdrew, hugging her knees tightly. The wolf lowered its head again, as if granting a silent reprieve. I looked around for any signs of other people. Rescuers, photographers, journalists. Nothing. Just the two of them, alone in the decaying house. Part of me still wanted to believe this was an odd coincidence, but deep in my gut, I felt the truth. Nature had conspired to bring these two souls together, and their story was far from ordinary. My heart pounded. I thought, maybe I should call it in now, before something happens. But my feet remained rooted. My flashlight beam wavered as I struggled to steady my hand. I wanted to reach for my radio, to seek backup. Yet another voice inside me urged caution. What if any loud crackle of static would frighten the wolf and the girl? I swallowed again and forced my legs to move forward towards them. The wolf watched with calm acceptance. The girl's eyes flickered with something, recognition, relief. As I closed the distance, the air seemed to hum with tension and wonder in equal measure. I paused just inside the doorway, flashlight trained on the scene. My mind reeled with questions I had no answers to. How long had they been here together? Why had the wolf stayed? What terrible tragedy had befallen this child that she clung to a wild beast instead of people? I exhaled slowly, my pulse finally slowing. I thought, maybe I'm not here to rescue a cub after all. A strange sense of awe washed over me. I wanted to tell the world, but first I needed to understand this miracle. I took another breath, steadied my voice, and prepared to speak again. But before I could, the wolf lifted its muzzle and gave a low, rumbling growl, not of aggression, but of warning, a boundary drawn in the dust. I froze, hard in my throat, and for a moment I believed this was the end, the moment I'd decide whether to run or to stay. And then I thought, I'd seen enough to know this was no mere sheltering in a storm, no accident of fate. This was something far beyond my understanding, something prehistoric, profound, and utterly impossible. I thought the wolf might have just come in to wait out the rain, I whispered to myself, voice trembling. But nature had something entirely different in store for me. When I took that first tentative step backward, my knees nearly buckled. The wolf didn't growl, but it didn't move either. Its golden eyes remained locked on mine, calm yet watchful, as though deciding whether I was friend or foe. Behind me, the little girl pressed herself against its flank, her tiny body trembling, but not with fear of the beast. Instead, she clung to him as though he were her only anchor in a world gone mad. I paused, breath shallow, wedged between the crumbling doorframe and a rotting wall. Every instinct screamed at me to flee, to slam the door and call for backup. After all, I'd spent 20 years as a forest ranger training wolves, teaching them to obey, to respect boundaries, invade their space, and they'd defend it with lethal force. Yet here, in this decaying house, stood a creature that refused to play by those rules. The wolf's ears flicked, once, then twice, as though registering my hesitation. It was a subtle movement, barely noticeable, but in it lay a clear message. Do not touch her. I froze, struck by the realization that I was no longer the one in control. For the first time in my life, I felt subordinate to a wild animal, held captive by its silent authority. I slipped my pack from my back, my fingers fumbling on the straps, and set it gently on the dusty floor. My heart thundered so loudly, I was certain the wolf could hear it. Still, it did not shift a muscle. The child, her dress torn and stained, buried her face in his side. He lowered his head just enough for her to rest against him, whole worlds of meaning passing between them in a single, tender gesture. I remembered a lesson from my early days at the wolf sanctuary. Wolves do not forgive intruders. They circle, they warn, they attack without hesitation. Yet this one had done none of those things. Instead, he stood unwavering in his silent vigil over a tiny human life. I bit my lip, surprised by the swell of awe that rose in my chest. I took a slow, deliberate breath, willing my legs to hold me steady. My mind raced back to the countless times I'd issued commands to packs, sit, stay, come, and they'd obeyed without question. I'd always assumed the bond between wolf and human was one of clear hierarchy, man over beast. But this creature, this solitary guardian, was rewriting every rule I'd ever learned. Tentatively, I lowered myself onto a splintered wooden beam. My knees protested, but I dared not make any sudden movements. The wolf's gaze followed me, unwavering, yet devoid of aggression. The girl peeked around his shoulder, her dark eyes locking onto mine. In that moment, I sensed her relief, as if she'd found refuge in his presence and perhaps feared mine. I thought for a heartbeat that all the dread and confusion would melt away if I simply reached out to touch his muzzle. Instead, I found myself paralyzed, torn between the desire to prove I meant no harm and the instinct to maintain distance. My stomach knotted. Up close, I could see his fur was matted with grime, and there was a faint scar above his left eye. He was no figment of my imagination. He was real, and he was choosing to protect this child. A sudden crack of wood behind me, perhaps the house settling, sent my heart skittering. I started to push myself up, ready to flee, but then I remembered I was the one who had come here on a rescue mission. I swallowed hard and sank back down. I'm not going to hurt you, I whispered, voice shaking. The wolf's ears twitched, acknowledging my words without warmth or scorn, just acknowledgement. He had given me this chance. The little girl exhaled softly, wrapping her arms tighter around his neck. I looked into her wide, trusting eyes and felt a pang of guilt. What right did I have to disrupt this bond? Part of me wanted to scoop her into my arms and run, but another stronger part warned me that to separate them would be to unleash some unknown storm. I shifted the pack to my side, fingertips grazing my radio. Rescue teams could be there in minutes, but what then? Would they shoot him? Trap him? I felt a surge of panic at the thought. I clenched my jaw. No, he deserved more than that. He had chosen compassion over instinct. He had defied the very nature of his kind. A wave of emotion washed over me, from fear to respect to wonder. I realized I was witnessing something extraordinary, an alliance born of necessity, nurtured by mutual trust. I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. How often had I dismissed such tales as fanciful myths? Now I understood. Nature still held mysteries beyond our grasp. My hand hovered over the pack's zipper. I thought, maybe I can offer food, show goodwill. But as I unlatched it, the metallic click echoed too loudly in the silence. The wolf's head snapped up, alert. The girl stiffened. I froze, heart pounding anew. I thought that was it. My chance to bridge the gap had shattered. But nature had a different surprise in store. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped into the cold twilight outside, flashlight in hand. The air was so still I could hear my own breath fogging against the beam. My eyes scanned the ground and froze. Paw prints, dozens of them, pressed deep into the soft earth. Each track was clear, 4 toes, a triangular pad, and sprawled in every direction as though the wolf had been on constant patrol. But alongside those prints were long, irregular scrapes, furrows gouged into the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged across the yard. My heart hammered so fiercely, I almost dropped the flashlight. I sank to my knees and followed the line of scrapes. They led toward a tangle of brambles at the far edge of the clearing. The wolf had dragged something from the house here. My pulse thudded. Was it prey? Was this how he'd lured the child into trusting him? I approached the brambles and forced my beam through the thicket. There, half buried under a layer of crisp, yellow leaves, lay a small, curled shape. I crouched down and recognized the hedgehog before it rustled, a tiny body with spines turned inward, as though frozen in fear. My stomach twisted. This was no casualty of winter's chill. Someone had gently covered the creature with leaves, tucking it in like a child. I swallowed, voice cracking as I whispered to the night, "What did you do to protect her?" The answer came in the pattern of tracks, the scrapes, the prints, the careful leaf blanket. The wolf had carried this tiny hedgehog here, stockpiling food in case they both went hungry. He had scoured the forest floor for morsels, dragging them back to this clearing, not for himself, but for the little girl. My chest tightened. I pictured her shivering in the house, eyes wide and tear-streaked, and the wolf returning time after time with armfuls of provisions, mushrooms, bits of rodents, the occasional twitching rabbit. He'd saved her life with every unspoken sacrifice. I felt a tremor of awe and guilt surge through me. I'd seen acts of mercy before, but never so deliberate, so wholly devoted to another soul's survival. I rose unsteadily and whirled, sweeping the yard with my light. Every pile of leaves, every hollow log, became a testament to his care. I could almost imagine the rhythm of his footsteps, back and forth, his muzzle nudging earthen crumbs into her trembling hand. In that moment, I understood the depths of his devotion. He had chosen to feed her first, to go hungry himself. A tear slipped down my cheek as I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam jittering. My mind reeled. How could an animal, a fierce predator, show more compassion than many humans I'd known? My years as a ranger taught me to respect wildlife, but I never expected this. I thought I understood nature's balance, predator and prey, hunter and hunted. But here was something beyond instinct. Here was a conscious decision to nurture and protect. I closed my eyes, trying to steady myself, but every heartbeat rattled my ribs. I thought of the little girl's hollow look when I first found her, the way her hands trembled as she clutched at the wolf's fur. Now I saw why she trusted him. He had kept her alive, piece by piece, in the shadow of this forgotten homestead. A sudden rustle behind me made me spin around, just a deer slipping between the trees. I exhaled shakily. I fumbled for my radio. "This is Jenkins. I need immediate evac for a child and a wolf. Possible animal attack situation." My finger hovered over the button. I imagined the response: sirens, flashing lights, veterinarians, child services, and then the moment of truth. What would happen to the wolf? Would they tranquilize him, remove him, punish him for a crime he never committed? My pulse thundered as the reality settled in. I thought, I have to get her out now, before it's too late. But as the words formed in my mind, before I pressed the button, a cold dread clutched my heart. I pictured the wolf hearing my voice over the radio, sensing strangers approaching, weapons drawn. A part of me recoiled. Rescuing her might destroy everything he'd built here. I swallowed and let the radio slip from my grasp. My voice shook as I whispered to the night, "He's done enough. Leave him be." But the urgency clawed at me. What if he decided it was enough, that I was an enemy? I told myself I had to act fast, for her sake and his. I made my decision. I would bring her out immediately, take her to safety, hope he would follow me peacefully. My hands trembled as I lifted the radio again. I keyed the mic, ready to call for help. But nature, it seemed, was writing its own script. I thought, this is my chance to save her, to show the world an animal's heart. Then I remembered how tightly she clung to the wolf's side, how the wolf watched me with such solemn trust. I hesitated. My finger hovered. I was sure I'd get her out in time, until I realized the night had other plans. When I leaned forward, arms outstretched, I fully expected the wolf to snarl and lunge. Instead, he rose to his feet with a silent grace, sliding between me and the trembling child as though he were a living barrier of fur and muscle. His eyes, and I'll never forget that look, were neither feral nor fearful, but deeply, unflinchingly deliberate. He was saying, without a sound, "Stay back." My heart jackhammered in my chest. The girl's face crumpled, and she pressed herself tighter against his side, tears spilling down her cheeks in glistening rivulets. She buried her small hands in his matted mane, clinging for comfort. And in that moment I understood with bone-deep clarity, she was not terrified of him. She was terrified of me. I paused, my outstretched arms frozen midair. Every rational thought fled as I watched her sob, her once bold eyes now brimming with despair. The wolf held his ground, ears pinned back in warning, yet there was no aggression in his posture, only a steely resolve to protect. I swallowed hard, tasting coppery fear on my tongue. Slowly, as if guided by some unseen hand, I sank down onto the splintered floorboards beside them. My knees hit the dusty wood with a dull thud, and I lowered my hands to my lap. The wolf's gaze flicked to me, then returned to the child, as if granting permission. "Sit. Listen." I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and folded my legs beneath me. I turned to the girl and spoke softly, words tumbling out in a gentle rush. "Hey there, I'm not your enemy." My voice cracked, betraying the tremor in my soul. She peeked through tears, glancing at me, then back at the wolf, as if seeking reassurance. I swallowed again. "Do you like stories?" I asked, and she blinked once, hesitant. So I began. I spun a simple fairy tale about a brave fox cub who journeyed through silver forests to save his family from a terrible storm. My words filled the stale air, weaving images of moonlit rivers and whispering trees. With each sentence, the girl's sobs quieted, replaced by ragged breaths. The wolf settled himself, lying down between us like an unwavering sentinel. His vast body curved protectively around her small frame, forming a living wall that neither of us dared to breach. As I spoke of the fox cub's courage, I glanced down at the girl, Her tear-streaked cheeks glistened in the weak beam of my flashlight, and she gently stroked the wolf's shoulder. She stroked the wolf like a teddy bear, I thought, and he endured it as if he knew she was all he had. The truth of it hit me like a blow. These two souls, so different by every measure, had found in each other a bond stronger than fear, stronger than reason. My own fear began to dissolve, replaced by a profound humility. Here I was, a seasoned ranger, trained to command respect, yet I sat in awe of this wild creature's compassion. I paused mid-story and let silence settle among us. The girl's breathing smoothed. The wolf's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm. I realized that in their world, kindness could be as fierce and unyielding as any predator's bite. I continued the tale, shifting its end to mirror what I'd witnessed. The fox cub and a human child, united by an impossible friendship, changing the forest itself. With each word, I felt the tension drain from my shoulders. I let the story carry me, weaving threads of magic and reality until the brambles outside faded and the crumbling walls disappeared. When I finished, the girl whispered a thank you, her voice soft but clear. The wolf lifted his head, his gaze meeting mine with something like understanding, an acknowledgement that I, too, had been granted entry into their fragile sanctuary. I nodded, tears pricking at my eyelids. I reached out, very slowly, placing my hand gently on the wolf's flank. He didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned into my palm, as though accepting me into his silent truce. My cheek brushed against his fur, and in that touch, I felt an echo of their shared trust. We remained like that for a long moment, the three of us bound by a thread of wonder and mutual acceptance. Then, as if sensing the world beyond the threshold returning, the wolf rose and nudged the girl's shoulder, urging her to stand. She obeyed, her small hand slipping into mine. I rose with her, heart pounding, and together we stepped past the wolf's broad form. He watched us go, unwavering, until we reached the doorway. Then, without a sound, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the ruined house, leaving me holding the child's hand and a truth that would haunt me forever. Sometimes, the fiercest protectors wear fur, and the purest bonds are forged in the wild. When she pushed herself up, I almost reached out to steady her. Her legs were unsteady, but determination shone in her eyes. She took 2 tentative steps toward me, her tiny hand lifting as if to touch my coat. I felt my chest tighten. At last, she trusted me enough to come to my side. But before she could cross the threshold between us, a soft rustle of fur drew my attention behind. The wolf emerged from the shadows like a whisper, padding silently to my back. He paused, head tilted, as if weighing his next move. I froze. Then, with deliberate gentleness, he sank his teeth into the strap of my backpack. My breath caught. He wasn't attacking me, he was trying to open it. He tugged, 2 quick jerks, and I realized what he wanted. I leaned forward and unzipped the compartment. Steam curled from the silver thermos tucked inside. The girl's eyes widened. She looked from me to the wolf, and without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the small pastry I'd slipped in earlier. Her little fingers trembled as she offered it first to her guardian. "For you," she seemed to say. The wolf's dark muzzle hovered over the sweet treat, and he took it gently, as one might accept an offering at an altar. His teeth closed around the edge of the pastry, careful not to crush it, and he lifted it to her level. She giggled, a soft, incredulous laugh, and held it out. He sniffed, then devoured it in a single, reverent bite. I felt a sharp tug at my own emotions, envy, awe, something close to reverence. Here was a creature I had always considered wild, untamed, driven by hunger and instinct, and yet here he was, guiding this child's hand, teaching her the ritual of giving and receiving. My eyes stung, and tears blurred the dim light. "Thank you," I choked out to both of them, though I was not sure to whom. The girl looked up, cheeks flushed, and smiled shyly. The wolf's ears flicked backward in a gesture that, to my mind, meant understanding. In that shared glance, I saw the truth. They were a family, not in the usual sense of blood ties or legal bonds, but in a way more profound, a pact of survival and care that transcended species. I raised my phone with trembling hands and snapped a photo. The flash was muted by the dusty air, but it captured the moment. The girl, her arm draped around the wolf's neck, the wolf, patient and proud, and me, standing slightly behind, tears sliding unnoticed down my face. I looked at the image on my screen and felt a wave of disbelief. Had I really just witnessed such an impossible scene? I lowered the phone and sank to my knees beside them. The wolf nudged my shoulder with his snout, as if reassuring me that it was okay, that I belonged here too. The girl leaned in and laid her head against his side. I reached out, placing my hand on the wolf's back. His coarse fur pressed against my palm like ancient bark. I could feel his steady heartbeat beneath my fingers, a rhythm that echoed in my own chest. "Family," I whispered, voice thick. Unbelievable, but real. My eyes filled again, and I let the tears fall. I'd spent my life studying animal behavior, cataloging patterns, predicting outcomes, but none of my training had prepared me for this. A wild creature choosing compassion over instinct, teaching kindness to a frightened child. It was as though nature herself had broken all her own rules just to prove a point. I glanced down at the little girl. She was humming softly, tracing lines on the wolf's flank with her finger. The wolf lay still, every muscle relaxed except for the gentle sway of his tail. They fit together as though carved from the same stone, two disparate shapes forming a single, harmonious sculpture. I reached into my coat pocket for another pastry and offered it to the girl. She looked up at me, a question in her eyes. I nodded, and she passed it to the wolf again, making sure he ate first. Then she took a bite herself, crumb by crumb, as if every morsel was a sacrament. My phone buzzed in my pocket, messages from rescue teams, probably asking for an update. I ignored it. In that moment, nothing mattered but the tableau before me. I would guard their secret, protect their bond, and share the story only when the world was ready to believe. And then I thought of you, listening to this tale. If your heart is racing right now, if you feel that surge of wonder and disbelief, then you understand what I felt in that ruined house. If your heart is racing right now, you know, subscribe to the channel. Nature is wiser than we think. When I pressed the call button on my radio, my voice trembled. "This is Jenkins. I need volunteers at the old Miller place. Child in distress, possible animal companion." I stood in the clearing, arms wrapped protectively around the trembling girl. Behind us, dusk settled like a velvet curtain, and every rustle in the trees sounded impossibly loud. Within minutes, headlights sliced through the shadows, engines idled, boots crunched on underbrush, and the volunteers spread out in a cautious semicircle around the dilapidated house. I guided the girl a few paces toward them, her small hand gripping my jacket. But as we moved, the wolf's ears shot upright. He sensed them before I heard a thing. He froze, body taut, gaze fixed on the newcomers. Next to me, the girl stiffened. Her breathing hitched, and she pressed her cheek into my chest, eyes wide with fear. It wasn't fear of the wolf, she looked at him with desperate longing, but fear of the strangers stepping into their fragile world. I felt a pang of guilt. I had brought the cavalry too soon. A volunteer called out softly, "We're here to help," but his words drifted empty into the gloom. The wolf's hackles rose, a shadow of steel and intent. He lowered his head, muscles coiling like springs, then, just as suddenly, bolted toward the nearest window. In one fluid motion, he leapt through the broken frame and disappeared into the forest beyond. The girl gasped and lurched forward, trying to follow him out the window. "Ooh!" she cried, voice cracking with heartbreak. It wasn't a word I recognized, but I understood it perfectly. It was her name for him, their secret syllable. It echoed through the air, raw with grief and accusation. "Ooh!" She broke free of my grasp and ran to the window, hands pressed against the cracked wood. I sprinted after her, but volunteers blocked the way, urging calm. "Don't chase him," I warned, voice urgent. "Let him go." But she didn't hear me. Her eyes were fixed on the dark tree line where the wolf had vanished. Then she froze, body collapsing in slow motion. One moment she was standing, calling his name. The next she sagged to the ground, eyes blank and distant. Her small frame went stiff, a marionette with its strings cut. My heart lurched. Volunteers shouted, but I waded through them, dropping to my knees beside her. I scooped her into my arms. Her cheek rested against my shoulder, wide eyes unfocused, lips parted in a silent sob. I rocked her gently, whispering, "It's okay. He'll come back. I promise." But my words rang hollow even to my own ears. I felt tears burn behind my eyes, and I let them fall. Volunteers knelt around us, passing blankets, offering water. I thanked them absently, half listening as they conferred in low tones. But my attention was solely on the broken shell of the girl in my arms. She clung to me like driftwood in a storm, as though I were the only solid thing left. My mind raced. What would she think of me now? I had promised safety, but had delivered heartbreak. I rocked her, humming the lullaby I'd whispered to her before, one I'd improvised in that dim room about silver rivers and sheltering trees. The words felt threadbare now, powerless against her despair. A volunteer placed a hand on my shoulder. "He's not gone forever," she said softly. "Wolves have territories. He'll circle back when he knows she's safe." I nodded, trying to believe it, but my chest tightened with dread. How many nights might she wait, calling his name, only to hear the wind answer? I drew a shaky breath. "Let's bring her out of here," I said, voice hoarse. Gently, I lifted her to her feet. She swayed, half dazed, but clung to me, fingers digging into my jacket. Step by step, we moved away from the house, away from the shattered promise of sanctuary. Volunteers formed a protective path as we walked toward the trucks. Flashlights darted across tree trunks, searching for any sign of their guardian. I squinted into the darkness, catching only fleeting glimpses of movement, branches parting, shadows shifting. A small part of me held on to hope that I might glimpse his silhouette one last time, a silent farewell. As we reached the first vehicle, I paused and looked back at the ruined window. The broken glass caught the last glint of daylight, and for a heartbeat, I thought I saw two golden eyes watching us, unwavering. But then, the forest swallowed the reflection, and only the hollow doorway remained. I gently set the girl down on a blanket in the back of the truck. She curled into a ball, eyes closed, clutching a scrap of her dress as though it were a lifeline. I sat beside her, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. She opened her eyes for a moment, looked at me, then drifted back into silence. I exhaled slowly, fighting the lump in my throat. The volunteers loaded blankets and supplies. Radios crackled with updates, their voices distant echoes in my mind. I leaned my head back against the seat, imagining the wolf's journey through the woods, how he would circle, how he would listen for her call. My heart ached with the weight of their separation, yet somewhere deep inside, I felt a stubborn flicker of certainty. He would return, because nothing in nature, not even the fiercest barrier of human hands, could sever the bond they had forged. As the engines rumbled to life and the convoy pulled away, I looked back at the dark edge of the forest. I whispered into the night, "Wait for her. She'll come back to you." And I realized that this goodbye, this raw, painful parting, was itself another beginning. When the volunteers sifted through the papers I'd found in the cottage, tattered birth certificate, a faded photograph, they pieced together the worst of it. The little girl had been left by her parents almost a month ago. A fierce blizzard had swept through these woods, snuffing out a family's promise of safety, and then the farmhouse had stood empty, save for the howl of the wind through broken windows. I remember the first evening I stumbled upon her and the wolf. I thought the snowdrifts outside had buried every trace of life. I thought the storm had swallowed them both. But as the volunteers traced his paw prints, I realized those prints began long before I arrived. They curled around the porch, threaded through the hallway, and circled the girl's small bed of blankets, frozen now under a thin crust of ice. They showed me the maps they'd drawn, linking each wolf track to a day on the calendar, the 5th of January, the wolf's paws pressed firm in fresh snow, the 20th, a single set of tiny human footprints appearing beside them, the 25th, the girl's prints leading only as far as the cottage door, then stopping. After that, only the wolf's prints continued, looping endlessly until they faded into the woods. My heart sank when I saw that. I realized he had found her on that first night of the blizzard, cold, alone, almost unconscious. His thick coat had brushed against her cheek, and something inside him had stirred. He could have left her. He could have sought food, shelter, his own kind. But instead, he stayed. He circled her, warmed her with his body heat, and hunted the woods for scraps of moss, rodents, even a frozen hedgehog, to bring back as offerings. The volunteers told me how they'd followed the tracks for miles, gathering evidence that the wolf had been her sole guardian. They'd found half-eaten rabbits buried under leaves and small piles of berries laid carefully near her blanket. They had never seen anything like it. They catalogued every find with scientific detachment, but I could see their eyes glisten when they presented the data. I stood there, shivering in my parka, and felt the weight of the story crashing into me. A wild creature, driven by blood and instinct, choosing compassion. A child, abandoned by her own mother and father, saved by teeth and paws. I thought of my own daughter, away at university, and my chest constricted. One of the volunteers stepped forward and pointed to the tracks leading out of the meadow. He followed her scent here every day, she said. He kept watch, making sure she was alive. I ran my gloved fingers over the prints pressed into the damp earth, the ridges still sharp despite the rain the night before. I could almost hear the whisper of his pads against the soil. I cleared my throat and spoke, my voice thick with emotion. He survived with her because he realized she wouldn't survive without him. The words felt too simple, too raw, but they were the only truth I could summon. The volunteers exchanged solemn looks. No one argued. No one offered a different explanation. They knew this was no accident of nature. This was choice. In that moment, I felt a tremor of awe ripple through me. I thought the wolf was simply a beast. I thought the child was merely prey. Instead, I discovered a bond deeper than any I'd known in my years as a ranger. A pact more profound than any oath I'd ever sworn to uphold. I glanced around at the ruins of the homestead, the shattered glass in the window frames, the sagging porch, the empty rooms where echoes of laughter once ringed. The wind carried the memory of her parents' footsteps, fading into silence, and I saw, on the threshold, a new story being written, one of loyalty, sacrifice, and an impossible friendship. My mind raced with questions I could never answer. How had he understood her vulnerability? How had she learned to trust him when she'd been betrayed by her own blood? I felt tears sting my eyes, and I blinked them away, unwilling to break the weight of the revelation with my own weakness. I closed my eyes and inhaled the pine-scented air. I thought the story had reached its end, that I could walk away, tell the world a tidy tale of rescue and redemption. but nature had one more secret to unveil, and I knew that this was only the beginning of a truth so profound that I, even now, struggled to believe. I stood there, alone in the clearing, listening to the wind carry the wolf's distant howl, and I understood, with every fiber of my being, that some miracles are written not in scripture, but in paw prints and tiny footprints pressed into the snow. When the phone rang that morning, I almost didn't answer. 3 months had passed since that night in the crumbling house, and I'd tried to let the memory rest, but the voice on the line was urgent. "Jenkins, we've got a situation at the Miller place." My heart slammed against my ribs. "The wolf's back," she said. "He's sitting on the porch, waiting." I didn't think. I grabbed my coat and raced through the waking woods, the sun a pale smear on the horizon. My old pickup rattled down the narrow track, tires crunching over frost-hardened earth. My hands trembled on the steering wheel as I remembered how he'd looked when he first emerged from the trees. Powerful, watchful, and, against all reason, tender. When I pulled up, the volunteers were already there, standing at a respectful distance. The house sat half buried in ivy, windows dark and dust-laced, but on the sagging front porch, there he was, the same broad shoulders, the same amber gaze fixed on the path. He sat like a king waiting for a summons. I climbed out and watched him for a long moment. His coat had grown thick with new growth. He looked well-fed, stronger than before. Yet his posture was unchanged, steady, patient, utterly still. Every instinct in me told me to call him away, to coax him back into the wild where he belonged. But something deeper whispered, "Let him wait." Inside, volunteers had prepared a small nursery room for the girl. She'd spent the past weeks in a children's home, learning to speak again, to trust humans. When I found her that first night, she was mute. Now she chattered in soft bursts, her laughter a fragile melody. I stepped inside and found her already waiting, coat on, face bright with recognition. "Ready?" I asked. She pressed her small hand into mine and nodded, eyes shining. We crossed the clearing together, volunteers falling back in silence. The frost crackled under our boots. With each step, my throat tightened. What if he'd moved on? What if this was a cruel illusion of hope? But as we drew near, he didn't move. He simply lifted his head, ears pivoting to catch our approach. In that moment, I saw it, the faint lift of his muzzle, an almost imperceptible nod. He remembered us. The girl broke free of my hand and skipped forward, boots crunching on the porch boards. She stopped at the top step and stared at him. For a heartbeat, everything held its breath. Then she climbed onto her toes and leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. His eyes softened, and he lowered his head until their foreheads touched. A single, sacred seal. Tears sprang to my eyes. I pulled my phone from my pocket and snapped a photo, but I already knew no image could capture that moment's weight. She whispered something I couldn't hear, and he remained still, as though offering himself up in a final gift. She straightened and looked back at me, eyes bright. I helped her down from the porch. She took my hand and turned to give him one last look. The wolf rose slowly, powerful legs unfolding like ancient oak. He took a single step toward her, as if to follow, and then paused. He flicked his ears once, and I knew this was his farewell. With a gentle breath, he pivoted and slipped off the porch, landing soundlessly on the ground. He turned his head briefly, amber eyes holding both of ours, and then melted into the tree line. I held my breath until he vanished into the shadows of pines and firs, carried away by soft echoes of his departure. The girl collapsed into my arms, tears running free. "He came back," she hiccuped, voice small. "He waited for me." I held her tight, my own tears soaking into her coat. Above us, the wind whispered through the branches like a benediction. Minutes later, we climbed back into the pickup, volunteers following in their vehicles. The sky had brightened to pale gold, and the woods seemed to hum with renewal. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "He gave us the greatest gift," I said softly. "He showed us that love can cross any boundary." She looked at me, eyes still wet but smiling. "I'll never forget him," she said. "He's my friend forever." I nodded, voice catching. "He's ours forever." As we drove away, the ruined house disappeared behind a curtain of saplings and vines. In its place, I carried the echo of a farewell more powerful than any storm, the silent pivot of a wild guardian who gave his heart, then walked away, taking only memories with him. I don't know who he was, a wolf, an angel, a spirit of the forest, but I know this for sure. He saved her, and he saved me. It couldn't have happened, but I saw it with my own eyes. If your heart is filled with awe right now, type, "Nature is wiser than we think."